chapter 1. Today we're continuing our study of the great themes of the Old Testament. And by the way, this is a topic that will continue into the new year. We're going to do one more quarter at least of this. And this is also a subject we can revisit in future quarters because there are so many themes that we could discuss for such a long amount of time. So we may take a break from it and then come back to it at a later quarter. We're ending this quarter dealing with the creation and the nature of man. We should have this week and then the next week on the doctrine of creation in the Old Testament, and then we'll have at least 1 week. Well, there will only be one more week, but we'll have 1 week on the nature of man or humanity. And then in the new year, in the next quarter, we'll have some discussion of the nature of man and then sin and worship and atonement and salvation, maybe some other things, but that's probably what we'll have. So those 4 or 5 themes we'll discuss next year. Haven't laid out the week-by-week plan, but we'll be doing that soon. Okay? No quiz today. I heard a sigh of relief when I said that. Some people said, "Oh, that is good." I was gone for 2 weeks, and so I don't really feel that I could require you to try to remember something from 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago was Thanksgiving. I was gone to my wife's family in Missouri, and then last week Joe did our Bible class, and so now we're back, and we're right here on December 12th, creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and then next week creation in the other Old Testament testimony, and then December 26th on the nature of man. Okay. Now, creation is a big theme in the Old Testament, not just in Genesis 1 and 2, but also in other passages. So next week we're going to be thinking about, for example, what the poetical books say. We'll look at Psalms, and then we'll also look at some prophecies. And when we say prophecies, we're using prophecy in the broader sense. That is, prophecy is not just foretelling, but forthtelling. The main job of the prophet was to speak God's word to the people. And specifically in the Old Testament, they were speaking God's word to call the people back to the covenant and to show them the blessings of obedience and the curses of disobedience, as we find in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where God promises them blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. So the prophets were calling them back to that. That's forthtelling, or speaking forth the word of God. But then prophecy also has, this is the minority of the text of the prophets, but it also has foretelling. So when we discuss what the prophet books or the prophetical books say about creation, it's forthtelling. It's discussing what's happened in the past. Although there also is a focus, we're not going to really deal with this, but there's also a focus on recreation. That is the recreation of God's people when they come back from captivity, and then even further into the future, the recreation of sinners into saints in the kingdom that would be the Davidic kingdom, which is the church. So there's the future telling of how God recreates, but then there's also the looking back and saying there are a lot of implications to God's original creation. What does the original creation of the world and the animals and the universe mean to us today, or to the Israelites living in the whatever time period the book was written in? Okay, does that make sense? So we can talk about prophets speaking about creation. So not foretelling, but forthtelling primarily. Okay, the Bible records a 6-day creation and leaves no room for thinking that anything else happened other than creation in 6 literal days. Although the Bible writers were familiar with mythological accounts of how the world came to be, because they adapt some of the language from mythological tales from that part of the world, the ancient Near East. We may refer to the ANE. You may see the abbreviation ANE on the slide. The ancient Near East, that will on other slides. I don't guess it's on here. But one of those is the Enuma Elish, or the things from above. That's a Babylonian creation myth. And in the Babylonian creation myth, the chief god named Marduk overcomes chaos. He has a battle against chaos, and he builds the world. And so some people say, okay, well, Genesis is just a copy of that. They will say when Moses wrote Genesis 1 and 2, well, most scholars don't actually think it was Moses, truth be told. It was, but there are a lot of skeptics. There are a lot of people who say that Moses didn't write it. We can talk about that another time. But they'll say whenever it was written, it was just a copy of pre-existing myths. It was repackaged for the Israelites. So it's not as though there was a person who was inspired to write down what God really wanted him to write down about creation. It was just he had heard a lot of myths about how the world came to be. Nobody really knows, they would say, but he had heard a lot of myths, and he was a Hebrew, so he made a myth that sounded good to the Hebrews, and that's where it came from. So you see how different that is from saying God inspired Moses, who was living a few thousand years after the creation. Moses was living about 1,500 years, according to the Bible. He was living about 1,500 years. I should say Noah would be about 1,500. Moses would be about 2,500 years after the creation. And God inspired him. Obviously, Moses wasn't there when God spoke the world into existence. Moses wasn't there when he made Adam and Eve, but God told him what happened. So he wrote it down. That's what really occurred. But a lot of skeptics today will say Moses just borrowed from pre-existing myths. Well, it's interesting that the Bible writers use some mythological language, and I've given you the references, Isaiah 27:1, Psalm 74:12 through 14. We're not going to take the time to read those. I just bring that to your attention to say, if Bible writers wanted to use mythological language, poetical language, to describe God's power in this operation or that, not always talking about creation, but just if they wanted to borrow that imagery, they were capable of doing that. They just didn't do it in Genesis 1. That's the point you need to remember. They did not do it in Genesis 1. What they did in Genesis 1 was to give a historical narrative. Moses wrote down, as it were, a play-by-play of how creation occurred, and there is no hint of mythological imagery. It's just a straightforward telling of what happened. It's interesting to me that, and if you want to run down some of the scholarship on this later, you can study it for yourself, but scholars will often say, okay, he was borrowing from myths. He just took out a lot of the wilder elements of the myth when he wrote down Genesis 1 and 2. What they're really saying is, we want it to be a myth, even though it doesn't read like one. It's fascinating what scholars will do, the lengths to which they will go to convince you that it wasn't Moses just giving you a factual account of what happened. They will say it's mythological, it's just stripped of many of the mythological elements. Well, which is it? You see what I'm asking? Is it a myth or is it not? You can't say it's a myth and that it's just stripped of the elements of a myth. But that's the type of move that skeptics will make. Okay, we can talk about that another time. But let's go through briefly, and then we're going to read the text, and you're going to see what a straightforward, point-by-point explanation of creation Genesis 1 is. But here are some of the models that people have proposed to try to say it's not just Moses giving us a literal play-by-play of the creation. They'll say, well, it's not about the process of origins. It's not about how things were created. It's about the functions of things that were created. So Moses' intent is not to tell you how the universe came to be, namely, God spoke it into existence, and God said, let there be light, and let there be this, and let there be that. Moses is not really trying to tell you how it happened. He's trying to tell you how the things work that were made. But is that really true? When you read Genesis 1, isn't it mainly focused on God making things, God bringing things into existence? See, the functional model just doesn't play fair with the text. And then some will say, well, it's mythological. I mentioned this a moment ago. It's a legendary story, so there's no real connection to literary history. But is that true? Let's think about that for a minute. In Genesis, here I'm going to show you some differences between the Genesis account and some of these myths. In Genesis, God created man in his image with the honor of ruling the earth, but when man failed to live up to the character of God, he was punished. The Mesopotamian myth, again, and allegedly Moses stole from the Mesopotamian myth to make up his own myth that would appeal to the Hebrews. He just made it up based on the Mesopotamian myth. But in that, it taught that the gods created humans as slaves, but then when man did not serve the gods, they decided that man was a thorn in their side and attempted but failed to destroy them. Is that what happens in Genesis? Did Moses borrow that? No, that's not in there at all in the Bible, is it? In Genesis, God creates the universe, but is not identified with any particular aspect of it. That's always important to remember, that God made the universe, but is not himself the universe. You got it? He created something that is not the same as what he is. But in the ancient Near Eastern creation myths, the gods are associated closely with or even personified by particular aspects of nature, especially heavenly bodies, the stars and the planets, or the sea. Different aspects of nature. The gods are so closely identified with those that you can just say they are those things. But God isn't. And paganism is almost always, a shift back into that way of thinking. That God is the wind, and God is even your own heart, and God is, you can identify him with any particular aspect of nature you want to, which sounds very spiritual, doesn't it? When I was a kid, my probably first exposure to this was in the Disney movie Pocahontas. Okay? And by the way, if you enjoy that movie, I'm not criticizing you, but I always thought it was funny, because I was taught the history about Pocahontas and Captain John Smith before I saw the Disney movie. And so in the Disney movie, she sort of converts John Smith, who professed to be a Christian, into some kind of nature worship. He winds up seeing the virtue of all of the thinking of God as different parts of nature, which in reality is the opposite of what happened. Pocahontas converted to some kind of Christianity. But the point is, there's a shift back into that way of thinking. And when New Age religion, which is becoming so popular in our society, is a shift back into thinking, well, God is the trees, and God is the breeze, and God, whatever you want. But in the Bible, the universe is here, God made it, but God is separate from it to the degree that he is not identified with it. He can interact with it, he can cause a flood, he can raise people from the dead, he can cause the weather, he can send commandments, he can send plagues, he can do whatever he wants to with the universe, but that's not him. When God sends the plague of the frogs, think about this God sent the frogs. Is he the frogs? God sent the flood, but is not the flood. He turned the Nile into blood, but he's neither the Nile nor the blood. He makes those things happen. Okay. And then in Genesis, there's one God, but in the ancient Near Eastern myths, they're polytheistic. So did Moses borrow from these things or not? It's possible that some parts of the Bible use some imagery that are from these, but Genesis 1 is just a whole different thing. It's historiography. It's writing a detailed explanation of a historical process. Here are just some of the differences. And by the way, if you want to find similarities between different accounts, you can. Different accounts of different events, you can find some similarities. There are always going to be similarities between stories, even if they're about different things, even if they're told by different people, you can always find some similarities. But the differences are glaring. Look at this. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, there's a divine spirit, and they are cosmic matter, and they are coexistent and eternal. So there's always been matter. But that's not what the Bible says. There was just God, and then he brought matter into existence. In the Enuma Elish, there's a primeval chaos, and then Tiamat, the god, is enveloped in that darkness. Well, the earth is a desolate waste, or the earth is without form and void, and darkness covers the face of the deep. It's different. Light emanates from the gods. Instead of, in Genesis, light is created. Light's not just shining out from God. God brings light into existence. So we have some similarities. The firmament is created in both. Dry land is created in both. The stars and the sun are created in both. Man is created. And God's rest and celebrate. In the Enuma Elish, God rests and sanctifies the seventh day. So see, you can find similarities if you want to, but the differences are also glaring. And just because there are similarities, that doesn't mean that one caused the other. It doesn't mean that Moses was caused to write what he did because the Babylonians wrote what they did. Notice, we've got the stars and the sun. We got to explain where they came from. You want to be a Christian, you got to explain where they came from. You want to be a pagan, you got to explain where they came from. If both settle on creation, that's not that big of a surprise. It doesn't mean that one caused the other. Okay, we got that? You're going to probably hear somebody say at some point, Genesis is just a mishmash of ancient myths, because there are some similarities. And when you see the similarities, don't be scared. It's just to be expected that there would be some connections between those things. Okay. This chart I thought was very helpful, and Justin Rogers made this chart. He teaches Old Testament classes at Freed-Hardeman, and I thought this was a helpful chart. Okay, so we talked about the functional model. We talked about the mythological model. Now, some people say Genesis 1 is just figurative theological literature. It's intended to teach you lessons about how to live. It's figurative, or even an allegory where we find ourselves represented in the story, and the author had no intention to convey literal history. It's like Aesop's fables. Why are Aesop's fables so good? Or other tales that aren't true but teach a good moral lesson? Because you can sort of find yourself in the story. Like the tortoise and the hare. I really like the tortoise and the hare. Why? Because sometimes I tend to say, well, I'm a little far ahead. I can rest for a while. I got part of the job done, and so I think I'll just take it easy. Isn't that what the hare did? He got way far ahead, and then he started to think, I don't really need to try because I'm far ahead now. But usually when we're working on a project and we take that attitude, time slips up on us. Did you ever have an assignment in school where it was like that? And you said, well, I've written half the paper, and the due date's not for a couple weeks, so I don't really have to work on the rest of the paper. And then it gets down to the night before, and the paper's due. And you say, why did I take it so easy? I could have had this done. That's how it was with... Which of the characters in Peanuts always had trouble getting the assignments done and would say, well, Chris, I've got to read this book over Christmas vacation, but I've got so long. Christmas vacation is 4 weeks. It's not 4 weeks anymore, but back when when Charles Schultz was writing the Peanuts, Christmas vacation seemed like a long time. And they said, well, I don't have to read it. And then every comic strip, it would get a little closer. And then by the end, was it Charlie Brown? I want to say it was Charlie Brown who would always put it off. Well, we see ourselves in fictional stories. And some people say, well, that's how Genesis 1 is. You're supposed to see yourself in Adam. And you're supposed to think of yourself. God's a creator. We can create some things. It's like mirrors of our own beings. And so they say those things. The problem is, does the text teach that? Is there anything in the Bible that explains that? In Genesis 1 and 2, is that the main point? I'm not saying we can't find some lessons about ourselves in that text. Surely we can, but the main point is, here's what happened. And then there's also what we could call the sequential scheme model, which is the idea that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from two different sources. And so Genesis 1 was written by somebody at one point, then maybe later somebody else wrote Genesis 2, and they try to come up with a lot of contradictions between Genesis 1 and 2. And we're going to see that that's not true. When you read Genesis 1, it's like the play-by-play, and Genesis 2 is like the color commentary, where different features of Genesis 1 are brought out and explained, in particular focusing on man. Genesis 1 covers the whole creation. It starts with the beginning of day 1 where God creates what? God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates the universe. And then we get to the end of day 6, and the crown of creation is man and then woman. And that's the whole creation. But Genesis 2 zeroes in on the earth. It begins with the earth. And then quickly it moves to talk about humanity. So don't think there's any conflict. It's a different purpose. So if you're writing with a different purpose, you're going to focus on different things. And that's the difference between Genesis 1 and 2. No evidence in any manuscript. This is the key thing. There's no manuscript evidence that Genesis 1 was written and then Genesis 2 was inserted. Or that Genesis 1 was written by this person and Genesis 2 is written by somebody else. Nobody made a notation of that in any ancient manuscript. There's no indication in the text where somebody made a little footnote and said, by the way, this was composed later and inserted. There's nothing like that. It just reads just like any other book that goes from one chapter to another. So you're having to invent things if you believe in the conflict between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Okay, so that's just some background. Let's read it together. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. We'll read a little bit more. There's so much to unpack, but we'll just read a little bit more and then we'll make some remarks. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with them, with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser night to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the sky, and everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Now, that's a very important verse, that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So that emphasizes that there's no evil that God has created in the universe. It's possible that angelic creation had introduced evil by this time. We know that when we get to chapter 3, we don't know how long it is between this moment and the time when the serpent comes. We know the lifespan of Adam, which is 930. Is that right? I'm thinking 930. So we know some boundaries time-wise, but we don't know how much of that time elapsed before the serpent came, and that's the devil, and he appears to be a fallen angel from 2 Peter 2:5 and from the book of Jude. So at some point evil was introduced, but as far as the creation of the universe, no evil, nothing bad was made. So it's very good. And look at chapter 2 and verse 1. "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts." That is in agreement with the first law of thermodynamics, which is that neither matter nor energy is created nor destroyed. So you cannot create new matter. You cannot destroy any matter. You can't create energy. You can't destroy energy. The amount that we have is the amount we have. We can certainly play around with it, and we can make it less usable. That's the second law of thermodynamics, that matter and energy become less usable over time. That's the law of entropy. But we have what we have. So it's a very insightful scientific comment in chapter 2 and verse 1 that God was finished with all that. He's not making any new matter or energy. By the seventh day, verse 2, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Thus God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God created and made. Now, watch this. Watch how verse 4 zooms in to the earth. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Now verse 5, no shrub of the field was yet in the earth. So in verses 4 and 5, there's a dramatic zooming in. In chapter 1:1 through chapter 2 and verse 3, we're talking about the whole created work that God did. But then we zoom in on earth. And so that shows you the purpose of chapter 2 is going to be different from the purpose of chapter 1. Okay, notice some people have been tempted to say that Genesis 1 doesn't tell you anything about what actually happened. I keep stressing this, not because I think anybody at Lakeside has a problem with this. I'm just saying the world at large hates Genesis 1 and 2 in large measure. Notice all the way back at the end of the 19th century, this is not a particularly new thing, but the chair of religion and science at Columbia Seminary, where ostensibly they're trying to train preachers, said the Bible teaches nothing as to God's method of creation, and therefore it is not teaching anything contradicting God's word to say that he may have formed the higher beings from the lower by successive differentiations and as several series of acts. What's he saying? Theistic evolution, which is that God was in charge, but Darwinian evolution accounts for how all the living things came to be. And notice what Professor Woodrow says. It doesn't contradict anything in the Bible to say that God used evolution. Of course, he's living in basically the same generation, or you might say the generation right after Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species. And it was becoming increasingly popular. And you can see by the 80s, by the 1880s, it was catching on in academic circles. So we're about 150 years removed from that. And has it caught on just in scientific circles or academic circles, or is it everywhere? It's everywhere, isn't it? We come down to today. Well, let's go just about 80 years from Woodrow. It was on Leave It to Beaver. Ward was talking about evolution on Leave It to Beaver. And I love Leave It to Beaver. That's one of the best shows ever. But they should not have been promoting evolution on Leave It to Beaver. And actually, Hugh Beaumont, who played, I don't want to go too much into, but Ward Cleaver's actor, Hugh Beaumont, was a preacher. He was ordained in a denominational church somewhere, and he is promoting evolution on Leave It to Beaver. That just shows how thoroughly that doctrine had been inculcated in society and still is. People think you are ridiculous if in many circles if you don't buy into Darwinian evolution. Okay, and that's just an illustration. Here is Francis Collins, who was the founder of a group called Biologos. And logos, of course, is the Greek word for word, and it's in John 1, verse 1. Remember, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, Biologos is one of the main proponents of theistic evolution today. And so they actively promote that whatever modern science says about the origin of the world, Big Bang, organic evolution by natural selection and mutations, whatever contemporary science teaches, the Bible never has any problem with that. They say there's never any real disagreement. So Francis Collins founded that, and he says, God, who is not limited in space or time, created the universe and established natural laws to govern it. Okay, I'm fine with that so far. Seeking to populate this otherwise sterile universe with living creatures, God chose the elegant mechanism of evolution to create microbes, plants, and animals of all sorts. Most remarkably, God intentionally chose the same mechanism to give rise to special creatures who would have intelligence, a knowledge of right and wrong, free will, and a desire to seek fellowship with Him. This view is entirely compatible with everything that science teaches us about the natural world. It is also entirely compatible with the great monotheistic religions of the world. Is it compatible with Judaism? Just think, is it compatible with Judaism? What did we just read? Is it compatible with Christianity? I think those, last I checked, those are two of the great monotheistic religions of the world, aren't they? Well, what does Jesus say in Mark chapter 10 and verse 6? He said, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Adam and Eve have been around since the beginning of creation, not since millions of years of evolution after God started the world. So it is incompatible with Judaism. It's incompatible with Christianity. Notice what James Barr, who is the Oxford professor, he's passed away, but the professor of Bible interpretation and one of the leading experts on the Hebrew in the Old Testament, the Hebrew language. He says, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that, first of all, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. Notice what he's saying. If you study the Hebrew text, you would never come away with the idea that Moses means to convey, or the author means to convey, anything other than 24-hour days. He says all of the scholars of Hebrew, even if they don't believe that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, they believe that that's what the author meant to convey, if you base it on the text and not Darwinism, not your desire to blend in with contemporary science. If you just base it on the text, what it says is 6 literal 24-hour days. No Hebrew scholar would argue with you on that. Then he says, no Hebrew scholar is going to argue with you about the fact that the figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provide by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world up to the later stages of the biblical story, that is, a young earth. They tell you that you've got a straightforward genealogy from Adam to the flood, and that will provide basically the structure of a young earth. And then see that Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and to have extinguished all human and land animal life except for those on the ark. Now that's exactly what Genesis says, isn't it? And he says nobody who studies the language would argue with you about that. Well, who's going to argue with you about it? People who want to compromise with Darwinism. People who want to fit evolution into the text of the Old Testament. People who are being pressured by colleagues in biology departments in universities to say that the Bible is impossible, or geology. Those are the two disciplines that are so at odds with the Bible. That's the two main disciplines are biology and geology. It's very hard to be a creationist in those departments. But the people who just study the text will say, here's what it says. Okay, there are two main theories. We don't have time to talk about them in detail, but there are two main theories about how to fit eons of time into Genesis 1. We just read it. Genesis 1 gives you how many days? 6 days. And God is so precise to tell you that these are plain old, regular, ordinary days that he says in each case there's a period of light and a period of darkness. There's the evening and the morning. So you're going to have to figure out where to squeeze these days. One method is the so-called gap theory, and there are a variety of these gap theories. But in essence, what they teach is that there's a huge gap in between the first verse of Genesis and the second verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then stop. And there's a gap of eons of time, of evolutionary history, in between verse 1 and verse 2. And then when it says that God continued to create after that, that he was fixing what was wrecked. Because in those eons of time, there was all this evolution, a race of men, and sin, and possibly conflict in heaven, and possibly the devil being sent down out of heaven, and the earth was ruined. And so all of that happens in that space between verse 1 and verse 2. I hardly need to ask you, does the Bible teach that? Because it's in between the verses. So there's nothing there in the text that would convey that at all. But if you really need to fit millions of years into Genesis 1, then you got to fit it somewhere. Again, the people who care to do this are people who want to blend the Bible and contemporary science, whatever contemporary science says. Now, we're supporters of science. We believe in science. We don't believe in the people who call themselves scientists proposing things that are anti-biblical because of bias and not because of evidence. We don't support that. But we're open to science. We want to be amenable to whatever true science says. But this is a case of trying to mash millions of years into the text. I think you see what's going on here. You see. Okay, so how would we deal with that? Let's deal with the gap theory, and then we'll finish up next week and talk about the day-age theory. So I think I've explained this to you, that it's based on the alleged difference between the word created in Genesis 1:1 and the word made, which is used after the gap. So there are two different Hebrew words, and they'll say, see, there's one word that's used in Genesis 1 for created, and then there's another Hebrew word that's used after that. So that shows that God was doing two different things because you have two different words. Okay, keep that in mind. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then according to the gap theory, the language of Genesis 1:2 implies that there was a gap. They'll say the word translated was, where it says, and the earth was without form and void, means became. The world became without form and void. And whatever happened in the gap is supposed to explain how the world became without form and void, how it got wrecked. And then without form and void, they say, indicates the result of destruction. The problem is that's just not the way you have to read those words. That's not really what those words mean in this context. The word bara is used in Genesis 1:21 after the gap. So remember, bara is supposed to be the word that's used just in Genesis 1:1, and then asa is the word for made, and that's after the gap. So God did one thing before the gap, he did another thing after the gap. But wait a minute, the word that's used in Genesis 1:1 is used after the gap. So what does that indicate? The words bara and asa can be used interchangeably. You can use them to talk about creating in this passage. You can use either one to talk about making in another passage. They have a similar field of meaning. So you can't base your argument for the gap on the idea that God uses one word for creation in chapter 1, verse 1, and he uses another word later, although many people try to do that. But notice they're used in parallel in the same verse. Look at chapter 2 and verse 4, which we read a moment ago. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, bara, in the day that the Lord made asa, earth and heaven. Are we talking about two different things? No, it's just a way of saying the same thing. They're used interchangeably. And Justin Rogers, who I mentioned a moment ago, also points out that there are various other verses in which the words are used in parallel. And so you can go and study those verses later on if you want to. But look at the different Hebrew words that are used for creation in different passages with different shades of meaning, but all talking about creation. And we'll talk about this a little more next week when we discuss creation throughout the Old Testament. But look at this. Created, made, formed, made, fixed or appointed, established, founded, built, begat, brought forth, stretched out, formed, made. What you learn from this is in the Old Testament, you have a dynamic vocabulary for creation. It's not just two words. It's a ton of words. God uses all kinds of different Hebrew words to discuss what he did when he created. I say that because we should be very reluctant to accept an argument about what happens in Genesis 1 because God picked two words. God can use 20 words if he wants to talk about creation with different shades of meaning. And it's all talking about the same thing with slightly different emphases, but it's all creation. When you read that God established the foundations of the earth, Is that talking about creation? Well, sure, it's not the word bara, but it's talking about creation. It's not the word asa, but it's talking about creation. And so God can use a variety of words to talk about that. What about Genesis 1:2? Remember, their other argument, besides talking about the difference between bara and asa, is they'll say in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, we're talking about that time after the earth had been wrecked. Well, notice what two scholars say. The Hebrew verb translated was, I should have made that italics, but the Hebrew word translated was refers to the time when God began his work of creation. Was does not mean that the earth remained in this shapeless state for a long time, nor does it mean that it became such after being something else earlier. And the phrase without form and void does not refer to the result of destruction or depreciation, but rather the state of things before God had finished his creation. It was uninhabited and uninhabitable, but it was not a land of ominous chaos, as is often assumed. Sometimes, I'm almost done. I've got 10:14 on my watch, so I'm going to finish up. Sometimes people will say when Genesis says it was without form and void, they'll say, oh, it was chaos. It was a huge mess. That's not what it means. It means it just wasn't finished yet. God still had work to do in forming it. It was like the earth was still on the assembly line. It wasn't a huge mess. It just wasn't finished yet. And it wasn't a wreck. Can't you see the difference between an automobile that hasn't been fully put together yet and an automobile that's been wrecked? Isn't there a big, which one would you call this without form and void from Genesis 1:2? You'd refer to the automobile that hasn't been fully put together yet. You're not referring to one that was fully put together, was pristine and nice, everything was all right, and then it was in an accident and now it's been totaled. That's what the gap theory would like for us to believe. That's just not what these words mean. Okay? Well, you've been very kind to listen. So this week, focusing on chapter 1 and 2 of Genesis, and next week we'll say a few more things about that. We'll refute the day-age theory, and then we'll talk about other passages in the Old Testament that refer back to creation. Okay, thank you.